Hello everyone. Welcome back. Today, we've got some crucial news you don't want to miss. Let's dive right into the top financial headlines and break down what's happening. As we kick off a new week, let's take a look at 5 major economic events that are set to unfold. These are key events that global investors are paying close attention to. First up is the Federal Reserve's rate decision, coming this Wednesday. This is a significant event for global capital markets, including commodities, bonds, and currencies. The general expectation is that the Fed will announce a rate cut, but the big question remains whether it will be a 25 basis point cut or a more aggressive 50 basis point cut. Surprisingly, Wall Street is split. About half of traders expect a 25-point cut, while the other half are betting on 50. This kind of uncertainty is unusual, as Wall Street typically has a more unified outlook leading up to a Fed decision. What's interesting is that even inside the Fed, there seems to be division and anxiety, which could make Wednesday's vote especially dramatic. In addition to the rate decision, the Fed will release its quarterly economic projections, which are closely watched by investors as a fairly accurate gauge of future trends. So, both the rate decision and the economic forecast are must-watch events for investors. The second major event to watch is the People's Bank of China's announcement on Thursday regarding its 1-year and 5-year loan prime rates, LPR. There's growing speculation that China's central bank may cut rates, especially after August's economic data fell below expectations. Many are waiting to see if China will follow the Fed's lead on rate cuts, as this announcement comes just hours after the Fed's decision. The third key event is the U.S. retail sales report for August, which will be released on Monday. Retail sales are a critical indicator of consumer spending, which drives much of the U.S. economy. While this data may not directly influence the Fed's rate decision, it's an important gauge of the current state of the economy and could impact the stock, bond, and commodity markets. The fourth event is the release of the UK's August Consumer Price Index, CPI, and Core CPI on Tuesday. This data will heavily influence the Bank of England's future rate decisions and the strength of the British pound. Finally, on Thursday, the Bank of Japan will hold its policy meeting, and there's a lot of anticipation over whether it will raise rates. This has become a hot topic in Japan's political landscape, with candidates in the country's leadership race weighing in on the matter. While the general consensus is that the Bank of Japan will hold rates steady this time, there is an expectation of a potential rate hike in December. Depending on what the Fed decides on Wednesday, we could also see some movement in the yen, adding another layer of drama to the currency markets. So, there's plenty of market-moving potential in the week ahead, and it'll be fascinating to see how these events play out. The second piece of important news to share is a recent report from the Voice of America, titled UK Foreign Minister Lammy Plays Down Putin Threats. Today, UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy stated that Russian President Vladimir Putin's warnings that NATO would be at war with Russia if Ukraine were allowed to use long-range weapons to strike deep into Russian territory are nothing more than bluster. Meanwhile, Russian forces continued their assault on Ukraine today, using missiles, bombs, and drones to carry out airstrikes. On Friday, US President Joe Biden and UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer met at the White House to discuss whether to lift restrictions on Ukraine's use of Western weapons to target Russian territory. This potential move has escalated tensions between Russia and the West over the conflict in Ukraine. Lammy told BBC reporters, "I believe Putin is simply trying to mislead the public. There's a lot of saber-rattling here, which is typical of his behavior. He's made threats over tanks, missiles, and even nuclear weapons in the past." Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has been pressing the US and UK for months, urging them to allow Ukraine's forces to use British-supplied Storm Shadow cruise missiles, which have a range of 250 kilometers, and American-made long-range Army tactical missile systems, ATACMS, to strike deep into Russian territory. No final decisions were made during Biden and Starmer's meeting on Friday. However, Putin had issued a warning just a day before, saying that if Ukraine were allowed to use long-range weapons to strike inside Russia, it would effectively mean NATO, the US, and Europe were at war with Russia. He added that if the nature of the conflict changed, Russia would respond accordingly to the threats posed. Putin has often cautioned the West that its support for Ukraine could potentially lead to a nuclear confrontation with Russia. Lamy emphasized, "We can't be swayed by the outbursts of an imperialist fascist who invades other countries at will. If we let him succeed in Ukraine, trust me, he won't stop there." Lamy also mentioned that Biden, Starmer, and Zelensky are expected to revisit the issue later this month when they meet at the United Nations General Assembly in New York to further discuss the potential for Ukraine to use long-range Western weapons against Russian targets. According to Reuters, Russia launched a missile strike today on an apartment building in Kharkiv, eastern Ukraine, injuring 28 people, including 3 children. The attack caused a fire in the residential high-rise, according to the region's governor. My perspective on this news is that, while the UK Foreign Secretary dismisses Putin's threats, those warnings could still influence the final decisions made by the US and UK. I believe that any decision on this matter will likely depend on developments on the battlefield. If Ukraine's situation worsens significantly, it could push the US and UK to allow Ukraine to use long-range missiles against strategic Russian targets. Not only has the UK rejected Putin's threats, but the White House also brushed them aside yesterday. They view the decision on whether Ukraine can use long-range weapons against Russian targets as something to be determined through discussions between Ukraine, the US, and the UK. The third major news story I want to share is a headline from today's top news in Israel, reported by BBC. The article is titled, "Israel Hostages, IDF says it mistakenly killed 3 men held in Gaza." This story has caused a major uproar in Israel. The incident dates back to a raid on November 10 of last year, during which the Israeli military targeted and killed Hassan Brigade commander of Hamas. Unfortunately, during that same attack, 3 Israeli hostages were also killed by IDF airstrikes. The report states that in an effort to mitigate the fallout from these tragic deaths, the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, claimed that prior intelligence suggested there were no hostages near the intended target. In fact, the intelligence reportedly indicated that these specific hostages were being held elsewhere at the time. However, this explanation has done little to calm public outrage. The Israeli media and citizens are largely unconvinced by the IDF statement. The IDF has also been accused of dragging its feet in acknowledging these deaths. The military argues that the delay was not intentional but necessary due to the complexity of the investigation, which they say took months to complete. It wasn't until now that the IDF has officially confirmed that their airstrike was responsible for the deaths of the 3 hostages. My personal take on this news is that this event will likely deepen the negative impact on Prime Minister Netanyahu, whose government is already facing widespread protests. The protests against his leadership are still very intense across Israel. The fact that a military operation, supposedly aimed at rescuing hostages, resulted in the accidental killing of 3 of them will be a hard pill for the public to swallow. From any angle, it's clear that this is a public relations disaster, and it may take some time for the Israeli people to come to terms with this tragedy. The fourth important news story I want to share comes from Voice of America, titled "Myanmar Junta Makes Rare Request for Foreign Aid to Cope with Deadly Floods." Today, Myanmar state television reported that Typhoon Yagi has caused deadly flooding and landslides, claiming at least 74 lives, with 89 people still missing. Due to difficulties in gathering information, the actual death toll could be even higher. In an unusual move, Myanmar's military junta has issued a rare request for international assistance. The latest official figures released by the junta more than double the initial death toll of 33 reported on Friday. Before hitting Myanmar, Typhoon Yagi devastated parts of Vietnam, northern Thailand, and Laos, causing over 260 deaths and significant destruction. Following the broadcast of Myanmar's plea for aid, additional information about the disaster was released. Floodwaters have inundated low-lying areas in central Myanmar, including Mandalay and Bago regions, as well as Shan State in the east and the nation's capital, Naypyidaw, since last Wednesday. Even the powerful military government seems overwhelmed by the scale of this natural disaster, prompting them to seek outside help. Meanwhile, another storm, Typhoon Babinka, is drawing international attention as it targets Shanghai, China. Interestingly, this storm has been described as a bullet typhoon due to its small but extremely intense impact zone. Babinka is heading directly for Shanghai today, so I urge anyone living in the city to stay safe and take precautions. International media outlets have reported on the measures Shanghai is taking, including the closure of its two main airports and limited subway service. However, during extreme weather events like this, there are always a few people who do what they shouldn't, like in the US, where some individuals defy warnings to shoot videos or post on social media. Let's hope everyone in Shanghai stays safe and takes this storm seriously. Wishing everyone there well. That's all for today. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more updates. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.